Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako. That means Let's Work Together, which is the name of our weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute, and we're delighted to come to you every week to talk about issues and movers and shakers that have to do with improving the quality of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in Hawaii and across the world. My guest today will be Wayne Hoffman, the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. What's interesting is that the battles that are being fought by this little think tank organization in Idaho are very similar to the battles that we are fighting here on the behalf of the people. I have joining me today our policy director for the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, Malia Blom, and we'll pick up first with each other, and then Wayne will join us hopefully after we solve some technical difficulties with Skype in the next segment. But Malia, aloha and welcome back to Hawaii, your home state.
Aloha, thanks for having me. I wish I could be there in person.
Well, some of our viewers may know you in print because you are prolific. You helped me to produce a weekly piece called The Grassroot Perspective, which contains essays, commentary, white papers, and a television program, which is a copy of whatever we're broadcasting on Ehana Kako. Tell everybody a little bit about that resource and what goes into producing some of the resources that we make available at the Grassroot Institute.
Well, as you mentioned, our perspective is really our kind of summary, our what you might have missed during the week. People want to keep up, but they're also busy. So that's our way of saying, here's what we've been doing. Here's what the important issues are that you might not be aware of. It's where you can find out, what comments we've offered before the legislature, what the latest is in the Jones Act reform issues, on OHA, on really all of the grassroots issues. And we turn out regular information. We do our policy papers. We do opinion, sort of shorter blogs and opinion pieces. Some of our various members occasionally like to submit, their perspectives, and we like to put those out there too for people to think about and talk about. And then we'd like to kind of bring it all together in one weekly newsletter.
That's right.
So I'm going to have to plug. If you'll excuse me, so let me plug the newsletter and say that if you're watching this and you don't get our perspective, go to our website, which is grassrootinstitute.org, and sign up for it. Or just email us at info@grassrootinstitute.org, and we'll put you on our mailing list. Make sure you get it.
That's right. And for those of you who may be new to Grassroot, that's Grassroot singular, the root of truth, grassrootinstitute.org. And we'll be very happy to put you onto that weekly resource, which is our weekly perspective magazine online. And you'll get several articles, papers dealing with individual liberty, free markets, limited accountable government, and you'll get a weekly video. Now, we're not the only people doing this, but it's an interesting and very important movement of think tanks that are focused on their own state. People may know some of the larger national think tanks, such as the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation or the Brookings Institute and so forth. These deal generally with national and global policy, and they're very important. But there is a movement of think tanks in each of the 50 states. And that movement is one which guards our freedoms, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We happen to be, in Hawaii, the representative here of the State Policy Network. The State Policy Network is exactly that. It's a network. It's not an organization. The members are not in any way legally related to one another or financially related to one another. Each member is independent. And here in Hawaii, we happen to be the member group, the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. Malia, can you explain a little bit about the purposes of the State Policy Network and the nature of this network, which is a phenomenal resource, this group or this network of think tanks, each of which is working on the problems within each state?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the kind of thing that, can sound, if you cast it the wrong way, conspiratorial in nature, but it really just makes a lot of sense, especially if you're coming at issues of freedom and liberty from a federalist perspective. And that means you want to maintain power in the states. That means that, without coordination, without discussion, without a sort of free market of ideas, you really just have 50 efforts trying to duplicate a lot of things and not being able to learn from each other. What SPN is, it's basically a network of free market think tanks. And there really is one pretty much in every state, sometimes more than that. And since we're working on a lot of the same issues, minimum wage, lower taxes, greater government accountability, we're connected by sort of basic principles. They're not every think tank has exactly the same philosophy on exactly every issue, but these basic principles are the things that tie us together. And working together, exchanging information, exchanging ideas, saying, this is what we've learned from our experience, maybe this will help you, is one of the ways that we can be more effective.
That's
and
right.
So it's a very kind of, let me give you my advice, let me give you the benefit of what we have learned. Or you can come to these other think tanks with something that's, unfortunately in Hawaii, we're often in the position of saying, hey, here's something that might become a problem for you. Because it's being talked about in our state first, something that you should be aware of, an issue on the horizon. And so I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, Malia. Continue, please.
Oh, so that way we can kind of say, here's how this happened in court. Here's how it's been interpreted by, our executive or administrative branches. Here's some possible legislation, test legislation that you can use. Here's the weaknesses of this approach. It's really a way to share our experience in a very informal way.
That's right. And one of the advantages of this network of state policy think tanks is that we get to see what works in each of the different 50 states and what doesn't work in each of the 50 different states. And that's very important because this perspective allows us to bring together best practices, so to speak. In other words, when it comes to certain fiscal policies, certain tax practices, and so forth, we don't simply proceed from an ideological point of view, and we most definitely do not proceed from a political partisan point of view, but we actually ask what serves the greater good and what really works. For example, Malia, you and I had the opportunity recently to weigh in and help some legislators here in the state of Hawaii to understand a little bit more about the general excise tax, the GE tax, and its relationship to helping the poor. And one of the interesting things is that much of our research behind our commentary on that and some of the bills that are being considered in the current legislative session came directly from these state policy network think tanks. In fact, we learned through this research that there are 32 states that decided to take a measure, which is to stop taxing food through the general excise tax. And that's very important to be able to say that 32 states have considered this and have taken that action and that that's a best practice. We pointed out a couple of values of that. And Malia, do you want to share with our audience here a bit about why it is a great value to the people and why it's fiscally good to stop taxing food through the general excise tax?
Yeah, it's interesting because what we learned from basically reaching out to these other organizations is, we have the general excise tax, which is a little different from a sales tax. I guess that's its own separate problem and issue. But one of the things we learned is that this is one of the quickest, fastest ways to address problems and effective ways to address problems of income inequality without getting into sort of that complicated give and take of, well, we'll create a tax credit for this, but then not for this, and so on and so forth. We're talking about a simple, straightforward measure that has a significant impact on the way that people live, what it costs to live, essentially. And in Hawaii, with a high cost of living, that's especially relevant to us. So one of the things, that we looked at was basically how much, what is the difference this is going to make? How much will this save people? And, basically extrapolating from the experience in other states and then looking at what happens in our own state, we figured out that it was going to save the average working family about $450 per year to exempt groceries, food, from the general excise tax.
Now, that may not sound like a lot to rich people like our producer, Jay Fidel, and to whom I'm very grateful for his hard work on this program, but to somebody who can't change their car tires, or somebody who can't make an insurance payment, or the rent for that month, $450 is a huge amount of money. And so one of the things we discovered is that by exempting food from the general excise tax, you actually help the poorest segment of society. Back to you, Malia. Let me let you continue.
Exactly. We found that the average Hawaii family of 4 pays about $1,000 a month on groceries, which is almost twice what the national average is. And I'll try to avoid getting on a side rant about the Jones Act there. But this $450 we pointed out to the legislature when it was under consideration is exactly the amount of money that is that safety net for the poorest people. It's one of those things that's finely crafted without having to get into over detail as legislation
That's
goes,
right.
because it makes a huge difference to the specific segment of society that we're trying to reach. We're going through all this work with the minimum wage bill right now that's attempting to do the same thing, but what about this exception? What about that exception? And is it even going to be effective? What we were trying to point out with this exemption of the general excise tax was, here's something that you absolutely know will be effective. We can prove it's been effective in many other states.
And I think that's very important, because when we went before one of the Senate committees in the state legislature just a few weeks ago, so this is still a live issue, that committee was moved favorably. We were not lobbying nor testifying for or against anything. We were, however, pointing out that the poor would be served by removing the food from the general excise tax. And that committee passed out of the committee a bill containing that provision, which is historic, because in 5 years such a bill has never gone out of a committee. There is also something else we pointed out, and Malia, your insight here will be helpful. It won't cost the state more. In fact, we've found through researching the other states that stop taxing the food and medical services for general excise leave more money in the economy to be spent, and through the multiplier effect end up generating more funds that produce more tax revenues for the state. Isn't that an interesting thing?
Exactly. And here we go into the kind of the problems with the general excise tax on the larger scale of things, in that the way that it constantly serves as just another barrier for growing the economy in Hawaii. Our tax system, our taxes and our regulation, but especially our tax system, is not business friendly, and nor is it friendly to investment, not even low-level consumers.
That's right.
Who have to pay this accumulated cost of living.
Going to the experiences of the other 50 states is a very important part of showing that good policy doesn't have to be based upon ideology or based upon partisan politics, because you will find good policy being promoted by Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, and others in other states. And when we put the research together, it changes the frame of reference completely. If all that we were doing is saying, our principles call for reducing the tax burden of the general excise tax, or our principles call for not raising the minimum wage, it can sound very partisan. But when you actually sit before policymakers and open up the research and show them that as you survey 50 states, there are best practices and there are worst practices, and there are some practices that result in greater revenues for the state, and some practices that help the poorest in society, and do that on the basis of data collected state by state. Now that's a totally different frame of reference, and it also helps us to avoid lumping every state together and creating a national experience. And so this is one of the reasons that I think you, Malia, were excited to hear that we're going to have Wayne Hoffman today. I hope we can get him on, from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, because we're going to be able to compare some situations that exist in Idaho with those in Hawaii. Malia, what kinds of situations do you think Wayne is going to be talking about? I know you've been tracking a little bit some of our issues as they've emerged in other states.
Well, you mentioned the grocery tax, and sure enough, when you go to the Idaho Freedom Foundation, that's one of the very first things you see on their website is grocery taxes. It's funny. Their legislature, I believe, and I'm sure I need Wayne to set me straight, but I'm pretty sure their legislative session has been winding up recently, and they've been looking for tax relief and lower spending as well. Interesting, because we are accustomed to dealing with a lack of interest in cutting taxes on the part of a Democrat-leaning administration and legislature. They're dealing with that problem in a Republican, I believe they have a supermajority Republican legislature. So, this comes back to the thing you mentioned earlier about partisanship and about this network in general. There's a misconception that free market is the same as libertarian. And that's not at all true. This network of think tanks that is SPN. Some of them are conservative, some are libertarian leaning, some are complete libertarian, and some are just really truly think tanks. The central idea behind it is not so much ideologically driven as driven towards effectiveness. The idea being that, we'll do the research, we'll do the studies, we'll look at the situation, and we'll champion ideas that advance the free market and that we can demonstrate really do so.
That's right.
So that's how these different groups, and believe me, they don't always see eye to eye on every single issue, but that's how they're able to work together, is through looking for what works, what they can demonstrate.
That's right. And what works is based upon actual data. That's very important. A state is a unit that is almost like a laboratory. And when we pay attention to what happens within states, we can extrapolate, we can share, we can find best practices, and that's very important. The other thing about the State Policy Network being nonpartisan is that the focus is on the issue itself and what works for better governance. And that's very important. And so as a result, we have some interesting anomalies. Sometimes we find that practices promoted by State Policy Network think tanks are rallied around by Democrats in some states and Republicans in other states. Somehow, when we make the issue the number one thing, the color associated with it, the partisanship, changes and is subject to the local politics. For example, here in Hawaii, who would have thought of it? In this year's state legislature, a traditionally Republican issue, which is reform of the Jones Act, which we've talked a lot about here on our program, a 1920 shipping law, has again been generally Republican, but right now in our state legislature, a call for reform is predominantly supported by more Democrats than Republicans. It's an interesting thing, and it has more to do with taking a look at the issue than it does with lining up with party politics.
Yeah, you mentioned the laboratory of the states, and I just wanted to kind of go off of that. That's actually a common idea when it comes to constitutional law, and I think that also dovetails nicely with the intent of the State Policy Network, which is that, the idea in law is that, we, the federal government, we, the, federal judicial system, we will restrain ourselves from taking action. We will show judicial discretion and let these ideas and these issues work themselves out in the state first.
We had an interesting problem that was being dealt with by the State Policy Network think tanks, whether it was Grassroot Institute in Hawaii or the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and that was the fact that we had disparity in the distribution of health insurance. And people have known this for many, many years. Now, that disparity, however, had an interesting analysis if you look at data state by state. You would find that there are some states which have for many years failed to be able to find solutions for a great number of people, and these people have not been able to receive adequate health care insurance, or they were underinsured. But you'd also find state by state that there were some states that were stellar examples of having solved that problem. And Hawaii happens to be one of them. Our own state director of health insurance has come on board our program and pointed out that before the Federal Affordable Care Act, Hawaii had achieved 93% coverage of all people through health care, and charities took care of the rest. That was very interesting. There are several states that showed that they were able to manage this problem. And here's what we were doing in the State Policy Network. We were saying, let's look at what the better states are doing. Let's look at best practice and have other states copy that best practice. Now, there was a different frame of reference for looking at the problem, and that was to say, well, let's have a one-size-fits-all national solution, the Affordable Health Care Act. What's happening in the aftermath of that? We're discovering that many states are exempting themselves, and many states are going back to say, let's look at what has worked within individual states, and let's transfer that wisdom to other states. And that's part of the value, wouldn't you say, Malia, of what the State Policy Network think tanks are all about?
Exactly. It's kind of funny because, we get this federal healthcare law, and among the states that jump right on it and participate are the states where the situation was already in a good, we'll say, which already had good healthcare systems, states like Massachusetts and Hawaii, and the states that are exempting themselves tended to be the ones that before hadn't found a good solution either. It's a matter of frustration almost, and I do think that this is an example of a situation where allowing ideas and experimentation to come from the ground up kind of helps work through a lot of these problems when it comes to actually, putting things into action.
Well, we're going to come back after a short break. I'm talking with Malia Blom Hill, who is our Grassroot Institute of Hawaii Policy Director, although she resides in the Washington, D.C. area, where she can be of great value to us on issues that affect Hawaii from the federal government. And we're hoping we can connect through Skype with Wayne Hoffman, the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, another State Policy Network think tank. We'll be right back. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. You're watching the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll be right back after this short break.
Castle and Cook, Hawaii. Investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state. Collateral Analytics, empowering the real estate industry to make better informed property investment decisions. The Foreign Trade Zone, bringing the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone programs to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. Galen Ho, a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company. Hawaiian Electric Company, and its affiliates Maui Electric and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island. The Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, incorporating diverse perspectives to design a flexible and forward-looking energy strategy. Hawaii Energy, the state's energy and efficiency program created to help Hawaii's residents and businesses adopt a clean energy lifestyle. Hawaii Gas, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future. Hawaii Pacific Health, bringing technology and teamwork together to transform healthcare in Hawaii. The High Tech Development Corporation, attached to DBED, is the state's leading technology agency. The Scheidler Family Foundation, supporting educational, cultural, and charitable organizations, including ThinkTech.
Welcome back to E Hana Kako, a weekly broadcast on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Again, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute, and I've been talking with Malia Blom Hill, our policy director, who is from Hawaii, but she is in the Washington, D.C. area, where she can help us in terms of federal issues that affect Hawaii. We had hoped today to have the president of the think tank in Idaho, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, join us, and he may pop in at any time, but it looks like we're having some technical difficulties through the Skype, and that may or may not occur. But in the meantime, Malia and I have been talking about the State Policy Network, the many think tanks that exist in each of the 50 states, and some of the advantages that exist by helping states find their own solutions, and then comparing states with one another, even competing with one another. And so we'd like to chat a little bit about an important idea that is actually good for Hawaii and good for all 50 states, called competitive federalism. Now, Malia, when people hear competitive federalism, the key word there, federalism, sometimes connotes something very different than what James Madison and our founding fathers understood by federalism. Because today, federalism often means to people big federal government, and the states live off of that or take their direction from that. But what did federalism actually mean, and what does it mean in the most authentic sense from the constitutional frame of reference, Malia?
It's funny, you're taking me back to law school a little bit here. One of the interesting ways that I will learn to discuss the whole concept of federalism is in the extremely subtle difference between where you feel that authority should rest ultimately. And the basic principles of federalism, which are relatively, I won't say unique, but it's a very special idea in the history of global politics because it is unusual. It kind of forms everything about your cultural philosophy from the time you start it. You're basically saying that at any possible point, decision making should rest as close to the bottom, as close to the people affected as possible. So that decision making should start at the local level when possible, or and just move up from there. And so, the last resort, decision making and power, a centralized point. It's not saying that it's unnecessary, that centralized government is unnecessary or shouldn't exist. Federalism accepts the existence of a centralized government, but it says that when possible, you start down at the local level. Now, that's really a very interesting distinction from a more centralized, or some people would call it a socialistic approach, which says when possible you can put decision making at a local level. It's the difference between what should happen and what you could allow to happen if you so wished.
That's right. And so really the spirit of federalism is that only those things which the states cannot or should not do should be left to the federal government. And the federal government then should not be seen as the comprehensive government of the people within the nation, but rather the service bureau, so to speak, of the states, and that the real centers of power would be the states or even the counties within the states, that power really resides with we the people. So that's the fundamental frame of reference there. Now, Malia, it's interesting, you said that this was an innovative idea, a new idea really in Western history, the idea that government wouldn't reside primarily in the monarch or in the central government, but it would come from the ground up. And this is a distinctive of the experience of our colonists who became the founding fathers or framers of the Constitution.
Exactly, and you can see it in the Constitution if you ever, and I'm not saying it's really scintillating reading, but it's instructive. When you read the Constitution and you look at the powers as they're given to the Congress, it's amazingly short. It's a very short piece. If you think about what the Congress does today and what the Congress was envisioned in this extremely comparatively short part of the Constitution, you can see that there was always this vision is the Congress steps in for the things that just are not practical to deal with on a lower level.
That's right.
And so that's the vision of that our government is built, and it is, or it was at the time anyway, revolutionary.
Now, I know you apologetically said that the Constitution isn't scintillating reading, but you know that on your next trip back to Hawaii, you're going to go down to Gordon Biersch with the team, and we're going to drink Sam Adams, and we're going to be reading the Constitution to one another because we love it.
Illusion of fool for myself.
Now, before we go on to competitive federalism, and you've done a great job of explaining federalism, I want to just point out something that's quite interesting. These good ideas that the framers of our Constitution came up with actually existed elsewhere in the world. They didn't necessarily become dominant, but one of the projects of the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii is to work with think tanks in China. And in an earlier episode, I shared with you how we're working with Tianzi, or the Unirural Institute for Economics in Beijing, or the Lion Rock Foundation in Hong Kong. And one of the things that we're working on is a project to help show the Chinese that the very ideas of individual liberty and free markets and limited accountable government are actually present in the most ancient of Chinese political philosophy. If you go back to the original documents of Confucius and of his disciple Mencius, you'll find the presence of federalism, really. For example, one of the passages says this: when the emperor declares that a man should be put to death, then that needs to be taken to the furthest regions of the land, into the furthest villages, to the most common people, and if all of them agree that this man should be put to death, then it may be so. And the document goes on and on, saying that it is the people in the furthest regions, in the villages, who need to be honored whenever the central government says something. Now, this helps you understand why during the Communist Revolution, the documents of Confucius were banned. But what it does is shows us this, that our little state policy network in the 50 states of the United States is extending now to other nations. And it's not because we're saying that freedom, individual liberty, and even the idea of federalism is a Western idea that Asia can benefit from, but that if you actually go back to some of the best political writings of Asian thinkers, you will find at the heart of them this idea of holding government accountable and keeping the power at the level of the people, which is not to say that Asia has lived up to that well at all during the last 2,000 years of history, but it is to say that they have their own standard by which they can judge and critique themselves, which is the same standard that we attempt to hold by going to the constitutional foundations here in the United States. Isn't that amazing stuff, Malia, to see what's in common?
That's really interesting. I mean, this recognition that power resides in the people is foundation of our democracy, yeah, but it's one of those subtle differences, and not everyone gets it. It's really interesting to see it come out of China. I know way back in the 80s, I think it was Reagan who kind of made a joke about how our Constitution says we the people give the government these powers, whereas other countries, I think maybe the Soviet Unions at the time, Constitution basically says we the government,
That's right.
give all these rights.
Government has no power except what it takes from the people. And we must always remember that we the people is the legitimization of government, the source and the authority. Now, let's switch gears. We talked about federalism, but now let's explain the other part of that word, competitive federalism. And the correct understanding of federalism is when the power resides in the states and the federal government, like a service bureau, serves the needs that states individually or separately cannot serve. But there's something that's in between that, and that is when states each retain their powers, but work with one another. In fact, work in the competitive free market between states. Do you want to explain a little bit now what competitive federalism is all about?
Well, at the risk of sounding like a radical economist type, the basic notion is that everything has value, everything is competition, and choice is where the power lies. And that's as true for consumers. It's as true as picking laundry detergent or where you want to eat as it is in choosing where you want to live, which tax systems are better, which system is better for your business. Competitive federalism kind of touches on that. The idea that, it's not just companies that compete for citizens, it's governments, in a sense, that compete for citizens, that compete for investment, and that compete to be an attractive place. And competitive federalism kind of gets to the heart of that idea.
Certainly.
The fact that ideas are their own currency, that how you put them into action affects how attractive your product, in this case your government, your state, can be. And in that way, you also you basically test and demonstrate policy.
That's right. When we look at the data within each of the 50 states, we learned some interesting things. For example, we learned that the brain drain exists for many states, that they have a net outgo of talented people looking for jobs and so forth in some states, but they have a net inflow in other states. And what does this mean? This means that for the sake of job opportunity, business opportunity, and so forth, people tend to leave those states where the business climate is not that attractive and go to those states where it is attractive. Now, that makes common sense, doesn't it? And that's how competition works. And when you look at the data, you'll see a net outflow from places like Hawaii, where we live, but a net inflow to places like Texas. And when you analyze that, interesting things come up. You ask questions like, well, what are the tax policies towards small businesses? What is the business climate like in terms of the things businesses need in order to exist and to thrive? And when you see that they happen to have a direct relationship to attracting people, in other words, money and businesses to a state, we can come up with a set of best practices and export those to other states. So states then will become competitive. New York had this kind of thinking in mind when New York State decided that it was going to make its tax policies very attractive to new businesses that would move to New York and start their businesses there. They knew very well that they were trying to draw business away from other states, and in response, hopefully through the free market, other states will follow suit. And that's one of the ways that competitive federalism works.
Exactly. You know, it's when you make a decision on your own, you don't necessarily think of yourself as, you know, part of a greater movement, a demonstration of, you know, the tax policies of one state or another. But that's exactly what you're doing. I live in an area where I could live in any of 3 or 4 states and still be able to, you know, reach the same metropolitan area. We make a rational choice to pick the state we do based on the things that everyone else looks at: taxes, education policy, and so on. But it's part of a greater movement. It's one that makes some states more fiscally successful. So it makes other states to decide, you know, they're going to do this or that. You know, Delaware very famously is the home of a lot of corporations because they made a conscious decision to change their corporate law in a way to attract corporations. And, you know, when you look at these states, this brain drain, you know, which states are improving economically, which are on the decline, which have let's say, unfunded liabilities and bankruptcy issues, and which ones do not. A lot of the time, you can see, you can find a point at which the state changed its policies to attract investment, to attract people.
Well, you know, we don't want to proclaim doom and gloom in our country, but hope for tomorrow. And I think those of you who are watching us from across the world and all across the United States can take encouragement in this little story I want to tell as we close. There was recently a conference of governors, and an interesting discussion took place around a seminar that displayed the different approaches states are taking to replacing the technology behind the Affordable Care Act with state health connectors, and coming up with different means that will deliver the insurance system that they want delivered. And there were governors asking about which systems worked and which didn't work. And in that little laboratory where governors were learning that states were taking responsibility for their own health care connectors, what emerges? The better services, products, and companies that provide this are going to be the winners, because that's the way the competitive free market works, and as a result, the people are going to be winners, and that's what democracy is all about. Any last word? We've got about a minute left, Malia, and any of your thoughts to our audience today on this think tank talk that we've had on ThinkTech?
Well, I would just say that in the end, it's really about choice. You know, these think tanks, this working together, competitive federalism, it's actually just about creating choice for people in the states, for just regular people to choose a system, a tax system, a government system that meets their needs better. We're basically trying to give you the choice to put these ideas out there so that they can and see how they exist and thrive in a place where people can choose what works best for them.
That's right. Thank you, Malia, for being with us. Malia Blom-Hill is the Policy Director for the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. And I want to thank our audience for being with us today on ThinkTech Hawaii's Ehana Kako, a weekly program. Principles such as individual liberty, free markets, limited accountable government, ideas such as a better government that is more transparent, a better economy that is more robust, don't have to have political labels attached to them. The think tank movement is putting forth good ideas based on good research, and the practical proof is in the pudding when we take a look at the experience of other states. We hope you'll be back with us again for the next episode of Ehana Kako. Let's work together. Much thanks to ThinkTech Hawaii and the producer, Jay Fidel. Until next time, aloha.